February 28, 1945. 4:30 in the afternoon. Førde Fjord, Norway. Oberleutnant Klaus Weber pressed his face against the frozen window of the coastal freighter, SS Nordmark, watching the steep walls of the fjord slide past in the fading Arctic twilight. The cargo manifest in his trembling hands listed 3,000 tons of ammunition, replacement aircraft engines, and optical equipment desperately needed by German forces in northern Norway. Everything the Wehrmacht couldn't manufacture anymore. Everything they couldn't replace. The convoy had sailed from Kiel 6 days earlier, hugging the Norwegian coast in a calculated gamble against Allied air power. 10 ships carrying the lifeblood of Germany's northern defenses, protected by what remained of the Kriegsmarine's coastal forces. Weber, a logistics officer transferred from the Russian front after frostbite claimed 3 of his toes, had been assured the route was secure. British aircraft couldn't reach this far north. The fjords provided natural protection. The convoy would arrive intact. Through the porthole, Weber counted the other vessels. 9 cargo ships stretched in a loose formation, their gray hulls nearly invisible against the dark water. Above them, scattered clouds promised the cover of darkness within the hour. Just 40 more miles to Trondheim, just a few more hours. What Weber didn't know, what German naval intelligence had catastrophically failed to detect, was that 18 British aircraft were already hunting his convoy. Twin-engine fighters the Luftwaffe had dismissed as obsolete, slow, and harmless. Beaufighters armed with weapons that would transform the fjord into an execution chamber. In 11 minutes, Weber's convoy would cease to exist. Every ship would be sunk or burning. Over 500 German sailors would die in water so cold it killed in 3 minutes. The ammunition destined for northern Norway would rest on the fjord bottom, useless metal in the darkness. And the weapon that would accomplish this near-total annihilation? The same aircraft type German pilots had been mocking since 1942. The Bristol Beaufighter, the fighter the Luftwaffe called too heavy to fight, too slow to matter. The mathematics of destruction were already locked in the wings of those incoming aircraft. 20mm cannons that fired 600 rounds per minute. Machine guns that could saw a ship's superstructure like timber. Rocket projectiles that struck with the force of destroyer shells. And pilots who had perfected the art of coastal strikes to a science the Germans couldn't counter. This is the story of how British determination and innovation turned a dismissed aircraft into the most feared ship killer in European waters. How German overconfidence met precision British violence, and how a single strike on a February afternoon demonstrated what happens when tactical excellence meets industrial firepower. The weapon they laughed at the Bristol Beaufighter entered Royal Air Force service in July 1940, born from desperation rather than design elegance. Britain needed a long-range heavy fighter immediately, and Bristol Aircraft Company delivered by essentially grafting the nose and cockpit of their Beaufort torpedo bomber onto a new fuselage and wing. The result was brutish, utilitarian, and completely unrefined. German intelligence first encountered Beaufighters during night fighter operations in late 1940. Luftwaffe analysts studying gun camera footage and wreckage were dismissive. The reports filed to Berlin were scathing. Too heavy at 14,000 pounds loaded. Too slow with a maximum speed of just 320 miles per hour. Twin engines meant double the maintenance problems. The forward armament of 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns was impressive on paper, but wasted on such a sluggish platform. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, a Luftwaffe liaison officer who examined a crashed Beaufighter in Holland during March 1941, wrote in his assessment that the British had created a flying warehouse pretending to be a fighter. His report noted that the aircraft's combat ceiling of barely 26,000 feet made it vulnerable to German fighters that routinely operated at 30,000 feet and above. Its rate of climb was anemic compared to the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190. The conclusion seemed obvious to German tactical planners. The Beaufighter was a stopgap measure, a temporary solution until Britain could design proper fighters. It would serve adequately as a night fighter against bombers, perhaps, but represented no significant threat to German operations, certainly not to naval vessels protected by anti-aircraft batteries and fighter cover. This assessment would prove to be one of the Luftwaffe's most catastrophic intelligence failures of the war. What German analysts failed to understand was that the Royal Air Force wasn't trying to build a traditional fighter. They were creating something entirely different, a weapons platform that could carry devastating firepower across long distances and deliver it with surgical precision against targets conventional fighters couldn't effectively engage. The Beaufighter's twin Hercules radial engines, producing 1,700 horsepower each, gave it something German single-engine fighters lacked: range. While a Messerschmitt 109 had a combat radius of barely 400 miles, a Beaufighter could fly 1,500 miles, loiter in a combat zone, and return home. This meant British aircraft could strike targets along the entire Norwegian coast, from the southern tip to the Arctic Circle, all from bases in Scotland. The heavy weight that Germans mocked actually served a purpose. Those 14,000 pounds included armor plating that made Beaufighters extraordinarily difficult to shoot down. The twin engines provided redundancy. Beaufighters routinely returned to base with one engine destroyed, holes in the fuselage large enough to crawl through, and control surfaces shot to ribbons. They brought their crews home when lighter fighters would have fallen into the sea. But the real revolution was happening in the weapons bay and under the wings. By 1943, RAF Coastal Command had begun fitting Beaufighters with equipment that transformed them from conventional fighters into ship-killing specialists. The nose-mounted cannons and machine guns were devastating enough against small vessels. The addition of 8 rocket projectiles under the wings created something unprecedented. Each rocket carried a 60-pound warhead. When fired in a salvo, 8 rockets delivered the broadside equivalent of a destroyer's 5-inch guns. The rockets traveled at 1,400 feet per second, too fast for anti-aircraft gunners to track. They struck with kinetic energy that punched through ship hulls like tin foil. Against merchant vessels and small warships, the effect was catastrophic. Squadron leader Dennis Balsden, who commanded No. 604 Squadron during 1944, described the Beaufighter's evolution in a post-war interview. "We started flying them in '42 for anti-shipping strikes. The first few missions were learning experiences, to put it politely. We lost aircraft to flak, to navigation errors, to mechanical failures. The Germans thought we were a nuisance, nothing more. Then we learned to use the terrain. We learned to coordinate strikes. We added rockets. Within 6 months, German coastal convoys were terrified of us. Within a year, sailing in Norwegian waters during daylight became suicide." The key was tactics. RAF Coastal Command developed a strike methodology that exploited every advantage the Beaufighter offered while minimizing exposure to German defenses. Strikes would launch from Scotland before dawn, flying low over the North Sea to avoid radar detection. Navigation specialists guided formations using dead reckoning and the occasional glimpse of the Norwegian coast. When they located targets, usually through reconnaissance aircraft reports or signals intelligence, the Beaufighters would approach from behind coastal mountains, using terrain to mask their approach until the final attack run. The strike itself was terrifyingly simple. Aircraft would emerge from behind a headland or mountain ridge at masthead height, often less than 50 feet above the water. The first aircraft would engage anti-aircraft positions with cannon and machine gun fire, suppressing defensive fire. Following aircraft would launch rockets from 600 to 800 yards, close enough for accuracy but far enough to escape the blast. The entire attack typically lasted less than 2 minutes, from first sighting to last rocket launch, German convoy commanders had no effective counter. Fighter cover couldn't respond quickly enough. The Beaufighters attacked and disappeared before Luftwaffe aircraft could scramble. Anti-aircraft batteries found themselves targeted in the opening seconds of every attack, their crews forced to take cover rather than man their guns. Evasive maneuvering was impossible in narrow fjords where ships had minimal sea room. By late 1944, German naval losses to Beaufighter strikes were reaching crisis levels. Merchant shipping along the Norwegian coast was being systematically destroyed. The Kriegsmarine estimated that 30% of all coastal traffic was being sunk or damaged. Supply lines to northern Norway were collapsing. Troops there faced shortages of ammunition, fuel, and food. Yet German High Command refused to acknowledge the severity of the threat. Reports were dismissed as excuses for poor seamanship or inadequate air defense. The official position remained that Beaufighters were obsolete aircraft achieving isolated successes through luck rather than capability. Proper air cover and aggressive anti-aircraft fire, the High Command insisted, would handle the British threat. This institutional denial would reach its catastrophic conclusion in Førde Fjord. The perfect trap. Førde Fjord cuts into Norway's western coast like a 40-mile knife wound, steep-sided and deep. In February 1945, it represented one of the few remaining relatively safe routes for German coastal shipping. The fjord's high walls provided protection from offshore winds and concealment from long-range observation. Small coves and inlets offered emergency anchorage if weather turned severe or if air attack threatened. The convoy that entered Førde Fjord on February 28th consisted of 10 merchant vessels, ranging from 800 to 4,000 tons. Most were elderly freighters pressed into emergency service, their peacetime names painted over with gray camouflage. Their combined cargo represented nearly a month of stockpiled supplies for German forces in northern Norway: ammunition, vehicle parts, medical supplies, fuel, and replacement equipment, for everything from radios to aircraft engines. Oberleutnant Weber's ship, the SS Nordmark, was perhaps the most critical. Her holds contained 3,000 artillery shells, 200 replacement aircraft engines, and optical equipment for anti-aircraft fire control systems. Loss of this single ship would cripple German defensive capabilities across an entire operational sector. The convoy's anti-aircraft protection was typical for late-war Germany: inadequate. Each merchant ship mounted whatever weapons could be scrounged. Some had single 20mm cannons. Others sported quad-mounted machine guns. The flagship, a 2,000-ton coastal freighter named Tannenberg, boasted twin 37mm guns on improvised mounts. The entire convoy could collectively fire perhaps 20 weapons simultaneously. Against massed air attack, this was theatrical rather than functional. Naval escort was even weaker. 2 minesweepers, each displacing barely 600 tons, provided the convoy's only military protection. They mounted 40mm guns and depth charges, weapons useful against submarines, but marginal against aircraft. The minesweeper commanders were competent officers, but they commanded vessels designed for coastal defense, not convoy protection in contested waters. German planning assumed this would suffice. British air bases in Scotland were over 400 miles away. The Beaufighters' reported range made strikes this far north theoretically possible, but operationally unlikely. Weather in late February was typically miserable, with storms, low clouds, and icing conditions that made navigation treacherous. The convoy would reach Trondheim, unload, and return before British forces could organize an effective response. What German intelligence hadn't detected was that RAF Coastal Command had been tracking this convoy for 3 days. Long-range reconnaissance mosquitoes had photographed the ships leaving Kiel. Ultra-intercepts had decoded German naval messages, discussing the convoy's route and timing. Coastal watchers in the Norwegian resistance had reported the convoy's passage northward. By the time Weber's ships entered Førde, British planners knew their exact position, course, speed, and composition. Number 444 Squadron, based at Dallachy in northeast Scotland, received their briefing at 10 o'clock that morning. The commanding officer, Wing Commander John Lawrence, was a veteran of over 100 anti-ship strikes. His pilots were among the most experienced in coastal command, with an average of 40 combat missions each. They knew Norwegian coastal waters like British taxi drivers knew London streets. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. 18 Beaufighters would launch at noon, flying in 3 formations of 6 aircraft each. The route would take them northeast across the North Sea, then along the Norwegian coast, using terrain masking to avoid detection. They would time their arrival at Førde for late afternoon, when the low sun would be behind them, blinding anti-aircraft gunners. The first formation would attack from the south, striking the convoy's trailing ships. The second formation would attack 30 seconds later from the opposite direction, targeting the convoy's center. The third formation would position itself to engage any ships attempting to beach themselves or reach protective coves. Total time in the attack zone, 3 minutes. Maximum exposure to defensive fire, 90 seconds. Each Beaufighter carried 8 rocket projectiles under the wings, 4 20mm cannon in the nose with 300 rounds per gun, and 6 machine guns with 1,000 rounds each. Collectively, the 18 aircraft would deliver 144 rockets, over 20,000 cannon shells, and 108,000 machine gun rounds. This was enough firepower to destroy everything in the fjord twice over. The weather cooperated perfectly. Low clouds over the North Sea provided cover during the outbound flight. As the formation approached Norway, the clouds thinned, giving clear visibility of the coastline. The sun, already low in the winter sky, blazed directly behind the British aircraft as they turned into their attack runs. At 4:28 in the afternoon, a lookout on the Tannenberg spotted aircraft silhouettes emerging from behind the southern headland. He rang the alarm bell and was reaching for the intercom when the first Beaufighter opened fire. 11 minutes of hell flight, Lieutenant Peter McIntyre led the first formation down the fjord at 200 miles per hour, his Beaufighter's altimeter showing 60 feet above the black water. Through the armored windscreen, he could see the German convoy spread before him like toys in a bathtub. 10 ships steaming in loose formation, completely exposed, with nowhere to run. "Target the trailing vessel," McIntyre transmitted to his flight. "Guns first, then rockets. Make every shot count." His finger found the firing button. The Beaufighter shuddered as all 4 cannons opened fire simultaneously, joined instantly by the chatter of the machine guns. The combined effect was like a chainsaw made of light. 20mm explosive shells and half-inch bullets stitched across the water, climbed the stern of the rearmost freighter, and tore through the superstructure as if it were paper. The German ship was a 1,500-ton coastal freighter named Ingrid. She was carrying ammunition, which meant she was essentially a floating bomb. McIntyre's cannon shells ripped through her thin hull plating, penetrated the cargo holds, and found the boxes of artillery shells stacked in the darkness below. The explosion was visible for 20 miles. Ingrid simply disintegrated, transforming from a ship into an expanding sphere of orange fire and black smoke. The blast wave hit McIntyre's Beaufighter hard enough to slam him against his harness straps. Debris rained across the fjord. The shockwave shattered windows on ships 800 yards away. "Christ," McIntyre's navigator muttered. "Did we just do that?" Before McIntyre could respond, the second Beaufighter in his formation fired its rockets. 8 projectiles streaked across the water, trailing smoke, converging on a 2,000-ton freighter named Erica. The rockets struck almost simultaneously along a 50-foot section of hull. Each warhead contained 60 pounds of high explosive, designed to penetrate armor plating. Against merchant ship construction, the effect was overwhelming. Erica's hull split open like an eggshell. Water flooded into her holds through multiple gaping wounds. She began listing to port immediately, her death already certain. Men scrambled onto her deck, some wearing life jackets, many not. They had perhaps 2 minutes before she rolled completely. The 3rd and 4th Beaufighters concentrated their fire on a small coastal tanker. She was carrying diesel fuel for U-boats, 1,400 tons of it in her tanks. The rocket hits were catastrophic. Fuel exploded, then ignited, creating a fireball that climbed 1,000 feet into the air. The tanker became a floating bonfire, her crew jumping into water that was already burning from spilled fuel. McIntyre's formation swept past the dying ships and banked hard left, clearing the attack zone for the second wave. Behind them, 3 ships were already gone, or dying. 7 remained, their commanders now frantically attempting evasive maneuvers in a fjord that offered nowhere to evade. The second formation, led by squadron leader David Parnell, came in from the north 30 seconds later. They caught the Germans completely focused on the southern threat, their anti-aircraft batteries firing uselessly at McIntyre's departing aircraft. Parnell targeted the convoy flagship Tannenberg. She was the largest vessel in the formation, and clearly the command ship, her radio antennas and signal flags marking her importance. She was also carrying the convoy's most precious cargo, the optical equipment for anti-aircraft fire control systems that German forces desperately needed. "Tannenberg," Parnell announced calmly over the radio. "All aircraft concentrate on the flagship." 6 Beaufighters, 48 rockets, converged on a single target. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Tannenberg was 900 feet long and 60 feet wide. Against her, the British fired nearly 3 tons of high explosive in a coordinated salvo. The first rocket struck her bow, blowing apart her forward holds and anchor windlass. The next salvo hit amidships, destroying her engine room and killing everyone there instantly. The final rockets detonated along her stern, severing her rudder and blowing out her stern plating. Tannenberg absorbed 48 rocket hits in less than 10 seconds. No ship could survive that. She listed immediately, water pouring through dozens of hull breaches. Her crew abandoned ship, sliding down ropes, or simply jumping into the 40-degree water. Those who went into the water had minutes to live. Hypothermia would claim them before rescue was possible. The other ships in the convoy attempted to scatter. 2 freighters tried to beach themselves on the fjord's rocky shore. 3 others reversed engines, attempting to flee back the way they'd come. One simply stopped, her captain apparently paralyzed by shock. The 3rd formation of Beaufighters, held in reserve, now entered the battle. Their job was cleanup, destroy anything still floating, still moving, still capable of reaching port. Flight Lieutenant James Morrison took his flight after the 2 beaching ships. They were barely 300 yards from shore, their bows already scraping bottom, when Morrison's rockets arrived. The first ship, 1,200-ton freighter named Karin, took 6 rockets in her stern. The explosions blew off her rudder and propeller, but more critically, they detonated the ammunition she carried in her aft holds. The resulting explosion was nearly as large as Ingrid's death. Karin broke in half, her bow section continuing onto the rocks, while her stern sank in deep water. The second beaching ship died more slowly. Morrison's wingman placed 4 rockets precisely along her waterline, opening her hull to the sea. She settled onto the rocky bottom in shallow water, half submerged, but not completely sunk. Her crew made it to shore alive, the only large group to survive the entire attack. The ships attempting to flee backwards met the 4th and 5th Beaufighters. Squadron leader Parnell, having reformed his flight after destroying Tannenberg, led them in a stern chase down the fjord. The German ships, built for cargo not speed, could barely manage 10 knots in reverse. The Beaufighters closed at 200 miles per hour. It was a slaughter. The first fleeing ship took rockets in her engine room and stopped dead. The second tried to zigzag and was torn apart by cannon fire. The third made it nearly a mile before 8 rockets transformed her into a sinking wreck. Oberleutnant Weber, still aboard the Nordmark, watched it all happen through the porthole. His ship was in the convoy's center, surrounded by death. To his left, Tannenberg was rolling onto her side, her decks now vertical. To his right, a tanker blazed like a torch. Ahead, ships were exploding. Behind, ships were sinking. Nordmark's captain tried to run the ship aground, but she was too far from shore. He ordered full speed ahead, hoping to reach the rocky beach before the British found him. For 30 seconds, it seemed possible. Then Flight Lieutenant Morrison's Beaufighter emerged from the smoke of previous kills, lined up on Nordmark's stern, and fired. 8 rockets, 8 hits. Nordmark's stern disintegrated. Her rudder, propeller, and propeller shaft were blown completely off. Water flooded into her engine room through wounds large enough to drive a truck through. Her engines, suddenly losing all resistance, oversped and seized. She coasted forward on momentum, slowing rapidly, already sinking. Weber felt the impacts as physical blows, the deck jumping beneath his feet. He grabbed his life jacket and ran for the deck, knowing he had perhaps 60 seconds before she went down. Around him, other crew members were doing the same, abandoning their posts in the desperate scramble for survival. On deck, the cold hit like a hammer. The air temperature was barely above freezing, the water far colder. Men were jumping over the side despite knowing the water would kill them. Others were trying to launch lifeboats, mostly unsuccessfully. The ship was listing heavily now, making movement difficult. Weber jumped. The water was so cold it stopped his breathing. His life jacket brought him to the surface, but he couldn't draw air. The cold had seized his chest muscles. Around him, other men were thrashing, drowning, dying. The water was thick with fuel oil, making swimming nearly impossible. He forced himself to breathe. Small gasps at first, then deeper. His arms and legs were already going numb. He knew the statistics. In water this cold, survival time was measured in minutes. 10, maybe 15, if you were lucky, and young, and strong. Above the chaos, Weber heard the sound of aircraft engines. For a moment, panic seized him completely. Were they coming back? Would the British strafe survivors in the water? But the Beaufighters circled once, their pilots assessing the damage, then turned south and disappeared. The attack was over. 11 minutes from first shots to last rocket. 10 ships had entered Førde Fjord. None would leave. 8 were sunk completely. 2 were beached and broken, their cargoes ruined. Over 500 German sailors were dead or dying in the water. The British formation reformed over the North Sea, counting aircraft. All 18 Beaufighters were present. 2 had minor flak damage. 1 had a single bullet hole in the tail. Total British casualties: 0 killed, 0 wounded, 18 aircraft returning safely to base. The reckoning. The immediate aftermath was chaos. German coastal defense forces in the area had no rescue vessels capable of handling hundreds of men in the water simultaneously. The 2 minesweepers that had been escorting the convoy survived the attack by fleeing at full speed, but they could only rescue men within reach. Most survivors simply floated until hypothermia claimed them. Oberleutnant Weber was among the fortunate. A Norwegian fishing boat, operated by men technically working for the German occupiers, but harboring deep sympathies for the Allies, picked him up after 17 minutes in the water. He was blue with cold, barely conscious, but alive. Of Nordmark's crew of 48 men, 11 survived. On some ships, there were no survivors at all. The material losses were staggering even by late war standards. 3,000 artillery shells, gone. 200 aircraft engines, gone. Optical fire control equipment that had taken 6 months to manufacture, gone. Fuel, medical supplies, vehicle parts, radio equipment, all settling to the fjord bottom in water, too deep for salvage. German Naval Command in Norway filed an immediate report to Berlin. The language was careful, defensive, minimizing the disaster while acknowledging its scope. 10 ships lost to enemy air action. Estimated casualties exceeded 500. Critical supplies destroyed. Northern Norway operations threatened by supply shortfall. The report blamed poor intelligence, inadequate air cover, and bad luck. It mentioned Beaufighters only in passing, describing them as enemy twin-engine fighters conducting rocket attacks. There was no acknowledgement that this represented a fundamental shift in the naval, air war, no recognition that British tactics had evolved beyond German countermeasures. Berlin's response was predictable. Courts of inquiry were convened to investigate whether convoy commanders had shown cowardice or incompetence. The admiral responsible for Norwegian coastal operations was relieved of command and transferred to a meaningless staff position. Fighter units were ordered to provide more aggressive convoy protection, though with what aircraft and fuel remained unclear. What didn't change was the fundamental assessment of Beaufighters. They remained classified as obsolete aircraft, achieving isolated successes. The official narrative held that proper precautions would prevent future disasters. Improved anti-aircraft training, better air cover, more aggressive routing, all would solve the problem. This institutional blindness persisted even as Beaufighter strikes continued and intensified. On March 6th, just 6 days after Førdefjord, another German convoy was destroyed in Sognefjord. 12 ships, all sunk or beached, in an attack lasting 9 minutes. On March 14th, Beaufighters caught a tanker convoy off Stavanger and created a fuel fire visible for 30 miles. On March 23rd, they destroyed 5 ships carrying iron ore, crippling German steel production. The pattern was identical in every case. British aircraft would appear without warning, attack with overwhelming firepower, and disappear before effective response was possible. German losses mounted into the hundreds of ships, thousands of sailors died, supply lines collapsed, and still, German High Command refused to acknowledge the fundamental problem. They had no counter to Beaufighter tactics. The truth was emerging in after-action reports that never reached decision-makers. German naval officers who survived attacks filed detailed accounts describing the terror of facing weapons they couldn't evade or counter. Fighter pilots assigned to convoy protection wrote frustrated reports explaining that they couldn't intercept aircraft that attacked and withdrew before scramble orders were even issued. Anti-aircraft gunners testified that engaging targets approaching at masthead height was nearly impossible. None of it mattered. The institutional narrative had solidified. Beaufighters were obsolete. Losses were due to operational failures, not enemy capability. Proper tactics would solve the problem. By April 1945, German coastal shipping along the Norwegian coast had effectively ceased during daylight hours. Convoys that had to move did so at night, accepting greatly reduced speed and increased collision risk as preferable to certain destruction by British aircraft. Supply deliveries to northern Norway had collapsed to less than 30% of requirements. German forces there were running out of ammunition, fuel, and food. The Førdefjord disaster specifically forced a complete reorganization of German logistics in Norway. The 3,000 artillery shells lost on Nordmark represented the entire monthly allocation for coastal defense batteries. Their loss meant German anti-aircraft and anti-ship guns were rationed to 5 rounds per gun per day for the remainder of the war. Aircraft engine losses grounded dozens of Luftwaffe planes that sat on airfields, perfectly functional, but unable to fly. Perhaps most significant was the psychological impact. German naval personnel requested transfers away from Norwegian convoy duty in unprecedented numbers. Crews threatened mutiny rather than sail in waters hunted by Beaufighters. The term Beaufighter weather entered German naval slang, meaning conditions clear enough for British attacks. Sailors would gather on deck during convoy voyages, scanning the skies constantly, knowing that the first warning of attack would be cannon fire already tearing through their ship. The Norwegian resistance networks reported all of this to British intelligence. They described German morale collapse, supply shortages reaching critical levels, and tactical paralysis in German naval operations. They confirmed ship losses, casualty figures, and the growing recognition among German rank and file that sailing Norwegian waters had become a death sentence. RAF Coastal Command analyzed the intelligence and the results of their own operations. The conclusions were clear. Beaufighter strikes had achieved strategic effect, disproportionate to the forces employed. 18 aircraft and their crews had accomplished what would have required a major naval operation in previous wars. The destruction of coastal shipping had isolated German forces in Norway more effectively than any blockade. Wing Commander Lawrence, who led the Førde Fjord strike, received the Distinguished Service Order for the operation. His citation noted that the attack demonstrated exceptional planning, leadership, and execution, resulting in the complete destruction of a major enemy convoy. The 18 pilots who flew the mission received various decorations, though many later said the recognition felt strange. The attack had been technically perfect, but almost mechanical in its efficiency. They destroyed 10 ships and killed hundreds of men in 11 minutes, then flown home for tea. The moral complexity troubled some crews. Flight Lieutenant Morrison, who personally sank 3 ships, later wrote in his memoir that he struggled with what they'd done. "We were very good at killing people," he wrote. "We'd turned it into a science. We could calculate exactly how many rockets it took to sink a specific ship type. We knew which sections of a vessel to target for maximum casualties versus maximum damage. We were professionals, and that professionalism made it easier to do terrible things efficiently." But Morrison also acknowledged the necessity. The Germans were occupying Norway, suppressing the population, and using Norwegian resources to continue the war. Every ship we sank was one less carrying ammunition to kill Allied soldiers. Every convoy we destroyed was one more step toward ending the war. We slept fine because we knew the alternative was worse. The weapon vindicated. The story of the Beaufighters' transformation from dismissed aircraft to feared ship killer represents more than tactical evolution. It demonstrates how institutional assumptions can blind military organizations to changing realities, and how innovation often comes from adapting existing tools rather than developing perfect solutions. The Germans dismissed Beaufighters because they didn't fit the conventional fighter template. They were heavy, slow, and ungainly compared to sleek interceptors. But the RAF wasn't trying to build an interceptor. They were solving a different problem: how to destroy ships in defended waters with acceptable losses. The Beaufighters' range, payload, and durability made it ideal for this role, even if it couldn't dogfight a Messerschmitt. The weapon system that evolved around the Beaufighter was revolutionary. The combination of rockets for primary ship killing, cannons for suppressing defenses, and machine guns for engaging small targets created a flexible platform that could adapt to any coastal combat scenario. The tactics RAF Coastal Command developed maximized these advantages while minimizing exposure to German strengths. But technology alone wasn't sufficient. The crews mattered enormously. By late 1944, Beaufighter pilots had accumulated thousands of hours flying anti-ship strikes. They knew Norwegian waters intimately. They understood German convoy patterns, defensive tactics, and behavioral responses to different attack profiles. This experience created a level of tactical sophistication that German forces simply couldn't match. The Førde Fjord attack exemplified this mastery. The British knew exactly where the convoy would be, what route it would take, and when it would be most vulnerable. They planned the attack to maximize surprise and minimize defensive response time. They coordinated 3 formations to hit from multiple directions, preventing effective anti-aircraft fire. They executed with precision that allowed total destruction while suffering 0 losses. German forces, by contrast, were caught in a doctrine that couldn't adapt. They continued trying to defend coastal convoys using methods designed for different threats. They expected air attacks to follow certain patterns, arrive from certain directions, and behave according to certain rules. When the British broke all those rules simultaneously, German responses collapsed. The institutional failure to acknowledge Beaufighter effectiveness cost Germany heavily. By refusing to recognize that British tactics had evolved beyond their countermeasures, German command condemned thousands of sailors to death and sacrificed critical supplies their forces needed. The dismissive attitude that initially labeled Beaufighters as obsolete persisted even as those obsolete aircraft systematically destroyed German coastal shipping. This blindness reflected a broader pattern in German military culture during the war's final years. As the strategic situation deteriorated, German command increasingly retreated into denial. Defeats were attributed to tactical failures, bad luck, or subordinate incompetence, rather than fundamental problems with doctrine or capability. This prevented adaptation and learning, ensuring that mistakes were repeated rather than corrected. The British, by contrast, demonstrated institutional flexibility. When early Beaufighter strikes achieved only modest success, they analyzed what went wrong and adapted. They improved tactics, refined weapons, and trained crews specifically for the coastal strike role. They turned an adequate aircraft into a war-winning system through iterative improvement and willingness to learn from experience. The statistical record tells the story. Between January 1944 and May 1945, RAF Coastal Command. Beaufighters sank or damaged over 800 Axis vessels. These included coastal freighters, tankers, minesweepers, small warships, and support craft. The tonnage destroyed exceeded 1 million tons, equivalent to Germany losing an entire year of coastal shipping construction. Crew losses were remarkably low considering the tempo of operations. Coastal Command lost approximately 100 Beaufighters to all causes during this period, including accidents, mechanical failures, and combat losses. This represented a loss rate of less than 1% per sortie, among the lowest of any RAF combat operation in the war. The human cost to German forces was severe. Conservative estimates suggest over 6,000 German sailors died in Beaufighter attacks during 1944 and 45. This doesn't include wounded survivors who died later from injuries or hypothermia, or the psychological casualties among crews who survived attacks but could no longer function effectively. The strategic impact extended beyond simple tonnage destroyed. German forces in Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands became increasingly isolated as coastal shipping routes collapsed. Supplies that would normally arrive by sea had to be transported overland, using rail networks already strained beyond capacity and under constant air attack. The logistics crisis forced German commands to reduce operations, conserve ammunition, and ultimately contributed to the collapse of organized resistance in northwestern Europe. Beaufighter operations also had a significant multiplier effect on other Allied operations. By forcing German coastal traffic to move at night, or not at all, Beaufighter strikes created opportunities for submarine patrols, surface raiders, and mine-laying operations. The combined pressure made Norwegian waters effectively untenable for German shipping by the war's final months. Post-war analysis by both British and German historians consistently ranks Coastal Command's anti-shipping campaign among the most cost-effective operations of the war. The resources required to field Beaufighter squadrons were modest compared to strategic bombing or major land campaigns, yet the operational impact was profound. German military logistics never recovered from the systematic destruction of coastal shipping. The Beaufighter itself served with distinction well into the post-war period. The final operational Beaufighter flight occurred in 1960, 15 years after production ended. The type served with air forces in Australia, Portugal, Turkey, and several other nations. Its reputation evolved from obsolete stopgap to proven combat system, as post-war assessments recognized its effectiveness. Today, only a handful of Beaufighters survive in museums. The RAF Museum Cosford displays a beautifully restored example, its paint scheme representing the exact aircraft type that destroyed the Fort de Fjord convoy. Visitors walk past, many unaware that this ungainly twin-engine aircraft terrified an entire branch of the German military. 3. Lessons written in water. The Fort de Fjord disaster and the broader Beaufighter campaign offer lessons that remain relevant decades later. They demonstrate how military effectiveness derives from matching capabilities to missions rather than pursuing theoretical perfection. They show how tactical innovation can overcome technological limitations. They reveal how institutional arrogance can transform manageable threats into strategic disasters. For the Germans, the fundamental failure was refusing to respect an enemy weapon system because it didn't match their preconceptions. Beaufighters weren't supposed to be effective based on conventional fighter metrics, so German command dismissed evidence of their actual combat performance. This cognitive bias cost thousands of lives and contributed to Germany's logistical collapse in Northern Europe. The pattern repeated throughout the war. German command dismissed Soviet T-34 tanks as crude until they destroyed German armor en masse. They dismissed Allied bomber formations as unsustainable until thousand-plane raids devastated German cities. They dismissed partisan resistance as militarily insignificant until it tied down entire divisions. Each dismissal reflected the same flaw, assuming enemy capabilities based on German expectations rather than enemy performance. For the British, the Beaufighter campaign demonstrated that innovation often means using existing tools in new ways rather than waiting for perfect solutions. The RAF needed a long-range ship killer immediately. Rather than design an ideal aircraft, they adapted what they had, refined tactics through experience, and created a system that exceeded what purpose-built designs might have achieved. This approach characterized much of British wartime innovation. Radar was adapted from scientific research for air defense. Escort carriers were converted from merchant hulls. Mulberry harbors were built from concrete caissons and surplus steel. In each case, Britain achieved strategic results by making existing resources work rather than waiting for theoretical perfection. The human element cannot be ignored. Beaufighter crews achieved extraordinary results through skill, courage, and determination. They flew missions lasting 6 to 8 hours over hostile waters, navigating by dead reckoning to strike targets in narrow fjords, then returned home often in deteriorating weather. The mental and physical demands were enormous, yet crews maintained operational effectiveness over hundreds of missions. Their German opponents showed equal courage under impossible circumstances. Convoy sailors continued sailing, despite knowing the odds were heavily against survival. Anti-aircraft crews manned their guns, despite being primary targets in every attack. The difference wasn't bravery, it was the systems supporting that bravery. British crews operated within a tactical framework that gave them every advantage. German sailors fought within a system that sacrificed them to maintain an illusion of control. Oberleutnant Weber, who survived Nordmark's sinking, spent the war's final months in a Norwegian hospital, recovering from hypothermia injuries. In post-war interviews, he spoke without bitterness about the attack that killed most of his shipmates. "We were sacrificed," he said, "not by British pilots, who were doing their jobs efficiently, but by our own command, who refused to acknowledge we were sailing into death. They knew Beaufighters were hunting us. They knew the convoys were being destroyed. They sent us anyway, because admitting the threat was real would mean admitting they had no solution." This bitter truth applied beyond ford to fjord. German command across all theaters repeatedly sent men into situations they knew were hopeless rather than acknowledge operational failures. The pattern persisted until Germany's final collapse, ensuring maximum casualties for minimum strategic gain. The Beaufighter crews grappled with their own moral complexities. They killed thousands of men efficiently and professionally, watching ships explode and men die in water they knew was fatally cold. Some justified it as necessary to end the war. Others struggled with the human cost of their tactical success. Most recognized they were participants in tragedy rather than heroes in adventure. Flight Lieutenant McIntyre, who led the first attack wave at Ford Fjord, wrote decades later about the emotional cost. "We were very young, mostly early 20s, and we'd become experts at industrial-scale killing. We joked about it because that's how you cope, but the jokes were dark. We knew what we were doing was terrible, even if necessary. The men we killed were mostly merchant sailors, not SS fanatics. They were doing their jobs, same as us. The difference was our jobs let us go home." This moral ambiguity characterized much of the strategic air war. Bomber crews grappled with killing civilians in German cities. Submarine crews struggled with leaving merchant sailors to drown. Fighter pilots shot down transport aircraft carrying wounded and non-combatants. Modern warfare created situations where ethical certainty became impossible, where necessity and morality existed in constant tension. The Ford Fjord attack represents this tension perfectly. 18 aircraft, 36 men, 11 minutes. Complete tactical success. 0 friendly casualties. 10 ships destroyed. Over 500 enemies killed. Critical supplies denied to German forces. By any military metric, a textbook operation executed brilliantly. Yet 36 men went home that evening, knowing they'd just killed hundreds in an attack, so efficient it was almost industrial. There's no clean resolution to this moral complexity. War creates impossible situations where all choices involve terrible costs. The Beaufighter crews chose to execute their missions with maximum efficiency, minimizing their own casualties while maximizing enemy losses. They operated within the moral framework available to them. The war was necessary, their contribution was valuable, and doing their job skillfully would shorten the conflict and save lives overall. History's judgment has been kind to them. The Beaufighter campaign is recognized as a significant contribution to Allied victory, achieving strategic results at acceptable cost. The crews are honored as skilled professionals who faced significant dangers and performed with exceptional competence. The moral complexity of killing hundreds of men in efficient strikes is acknowledged but not judged harshly, given the context of total war. The Germans who died in Ford Fjord and similar attacks are largely forgotten, except in local memorials and family histories. They were casualties of decisions made far above their level, victims of institutional failures they couldn't influence. They died cold and afraid in Norwegian fjords because their command refused to acknowledge a threat until far too late. The silence after thunder. The Bristol Beaufighters' War ended in May 1945 with Germany's surrender. The squadrons that had terrorized German coastal shipping were stood down. Their aircraft returned to Britain or scrapped on the continent. Many crews transferred to squadrons preparing for the Far East campaign, though Japan's surrender came before they could deploy. The aircraft themselves mostly disappeared. Out of over 5,000 Beaufighters produced, fewer than a dozen survive today. Metal was valuable in post-war Britain, and most were scrapped within years of peace. The flying examples became static displays, then deteriorated into parts sources, finally vanishing entirely, except for a handful preserved through extraordinary efforts. The men scattered to civilian lives. Some remained in the RAF as career officers. Others returned to the jobs they'd left in 1939 and 1940. The skills that made them deadly ship killers translated poorly to peacetime, though navigation abilities and calm under pressure served many well in civilian aviation and maritime industries. They rarely spoke about what they'd done. Post-war Britain didn't celebrate tactical brilliance in killing efficiently. The bomber offensive against Germany was controversial enough. Admitting you'd mastered the art of killing merchant sailors in their hundreds wasn't cocktail party conversation. Veterans learned to deflect questions or minimize their roles. "I flew maritime patrol," conveyed the general idea without troubling details. Some wrestled with it privately. Squadron leader Balsden, who commanded through dozens of strikes, eventually wrote about the psychological cost in his unpublished memoir. "We became very good at something terrible," he wrote. "That doesn't make us heroes. It makes us competent participants in organized violence. I'm proud of my service and haunted by my memories. Both things are true simultaneously." The German survivors faced even harder roads. They returned to a defeated nation, their service in Norway largely forgotten in the chaos of occupation and reconstruction. The men who'd sailed the convoys were scattered across British and American POW camps, then released to find homes destroyed and families dispersed. Few talked about their experiences. Survival as a veteran in defeated Germany meant emphasizing victimhood and minimizing participation. Oberleutnant Weber rebuilt a life in Hamburg, working in shipping insurance ironically enough. He never returned to Norway, never revisited the fjord where Nordmark went down. In a 1978 interview for a local history project, he finally spoke about it. "We entered that fjord knowing British aircraft were hunting us," he said. "Command told us air cover would protect us. It didn't. They told us the route was secure. It wasn't. They told us we'd make it to Trondheim. We didn't. 37 of my shipmates died because someone decided we were expendable. The British pilots were just doing their jobs. My anger is reserved for the commanders who sent us into death rather than admit they'd lost control of Norwegian waters." The historical record vindicated Weber's bitterness. Post-war access to German military archives revealed that German Naval Command knew coastal convoys were suffering unsustainable losses months before Fjord. They knew Beaufighter strikes were systematically destroying shipping. They understood the tactical situation was hopeless. They sent convoys anyway, because admitting failure would require acknowledging strategic defeat in the naval air war. For Britain, the Beaufighter campaign became a footnote in larger histories. The Battle of Britain, the strategic bombing campaign, D-Day, these dominated public memory. Coastal Command's systematic destruction of Axis shipping rarely merited more than passing mention. Yet the campaign's strategic impact was arguably as significant as more celebrated operations. Germany's inability to supply northern forces contributed directly to Allied success in northwestern Europe. The Norwegian perspective adds another dimension. Norwegian resistance networks worked closely with British intelligence to enable Beaufighter strikes. They reported convoy movements, identified targets, and confirmed results. After the war, Norway honored RAF Coastal Command's contribution to liberation, recognizing that British aircraft had helped strangle German occupation forces. A memorial stands today overlooking Fjord. It commemorates all who died in the waters below, German and Allied alike. The inscription is simple: "The sea remembers." Local historians maintain records of the February 28th attack, preserving the names of men who died when efficiency met desperation in narrow waters. The tactical lessons influenced post-war military development. The Beaufighters' success demonstrated that specialized platforms could achieve results impossible for multi-role aircraft. This insight shaped Cold War development of dedicated anti-ship aircraft, eventually producing systems like the Buccaneer and later precision-guided weapons that made ship killing even more efficient. The institutional lessons were harder to apply. Military organizations remain vulnerable to dismissing threats that don't match expectations. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, each conflict featured examples of conventional forces underestimating unconventional threats until catastrophe forced recognition. The human tendency to see what we expect, rather than what exists, remains a persistent vulnerability. The Bristol Beaufighter deserves recognition as one of history's most effective weapon systems, despite its ungainly appearance and conventional metrics suggesting obsolescence. It proved that matching capabilities to missions matters more than theoretical perfection. It demonstrated how tactical innovation can multiply the effectiveness of adequate platforms. It showed that institutional flexibility and willingness to adapt trump rigid adherence to doctrine. Most importantly, it reminds us that war's human cost persists regardless of tactical brilliance. The 11 minutes that destroyed 10 ships and killed hundreds represents both a masterpiece of military efficiency and a tragedy of men dying in cold water far from home. Both things are true. History should honor the skill while mourning the necessity. The last operational Beaufighter flew in 1960. The veterans of Fur de Fjord are all gone now, British and German alike. The ships rest on the fjord bottom, gradually dissolving into rust and memory. But the lessons remain, written in cold water and scored by rockets, waiting for those wise enough to learn them. The Luftwaffe dismissed Britain's Beaufighters as obsolete, slow, and harmless. That dismissal cost Germany control of Norwegian waters, thousands of lives, and critical supplies their forces needed. It demonstrated that arrogance is often more dangerous than enemy weapons, and that respect for what opponents can actually achieve matters more than theoretical assessments of what they should achieve. In the end, the milk bottle fighter proved deadlier than sleek interceptors, the dismissed weapon more effective than celebrated designs. The thunder of British aircraft over Norwegian fjords marked the sound of tactical evolution defeating institutional rigidity, of operational excellence overwhelming doctrinal certainty. The men who flew those missions and the men who died beneath them are gone. Their story remains, a testament to courage, skill, tragedy, and the eternal truth that in war, respect for reality matters more than faith in assumptions. The sea remembers, even if we forget.